Well, hello everyone. It has been a while, but we are thrilled to be back here. My name is Ben. I'm one of the co-founders of Al Fusaic, and so excited to discuss our very last Civilization 101, the Qarinvand Dynasty. We'll jump into it in a moment, but you may have been with us. We have 93 different ancient empires, civilizations, caliphates, dynasties, etc., on our website, the Al Fusaic Civilizations 101 section. And we have just published our final one. A huge thank you to Courtney for being our final publishing content writer about this ancient empire. I do want to say I know there are many more than 93 ancient empires, dynasties, kingdoms that make up the modern Swana region, Southwest Asia and North Africa. But 93 is we had to stop at some point, and it's a number we're thrilled to have had up on our site. All of the other 92 articles are there as well for you to read, engage, explore. And as you may know, most of our empires talk to one another. So there are several hyperlinks in the Qarinvand that go to the other empires, dynasties, kingdoms around the time of the Qarinvand, and all of those are also on our site and talk to one another. So you can sort of build this map of all of the ancient dynasties, kingdoms, empires, etc., that make up the region. So welcome all. Thrilled to have you here. This is being live streamed, but will also be cross-posted to our Facebook, our podcast, our website, our Instagram, and our YouTube. So you can engage with this great conversation with Courtney, our wonderful content writer. But the best place is the actual article itself. There's going to be more hyperlinks and knowledge and things shared there that we will dive into. With me, as usual, is Ana Campusano, another incredible content writer who will kick us off with the one-on-one word introduction. But I just wanted to say hello. Thank you all for being here for this final Civilizations in Review podcast episode as we talk about the Qarinvand Dynasty. Anna, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Ben. So this is the Qarinvand, known as one of the last Zoroastrian dynasties to exist prior to the Islamic Iranian dynasty. The Qarinvand dynasty ruled parts of the Tabaristan highlands in today's northern Iran. Tabaristan was ruled by the Dabuid dynasty through Dabui's Isfahabads. As one of the two Dabuid vassal kingdoms, the other being Bavand, the Qarinvand dynasty ruled from the 550s until the 11th century, persisting even after the Abbasids defeated the Dawood ruler and annexed Tabaristan. Little is known about Tabaristan's history under the Dawood Isfahabads, especially the Qarinvand dynasty. Nevertheless, its history can be understood through the linked dynasties, including the Bavand, Abbasid, and Dawood dynasties. I know that this might have been one of the toughest civilizations to investigate, considering, the information. But, connecting it with the Dawood, it makes me think about how prominent they also were at some point. So how was it that they were able to rule for so long, if you have any information about this, and preserve that ruling even through the Abbasids, which is, we know it's a very powerful as well empire. Courtney.
Sure. Great question. And thank you so much for having me here today. So I'm sure we'll get more into kind of the background on Qarinvand and everything, but one of the things I found in the research was that it was one of like two vassal kingdoms that ruled under the Buyid in the highlands of Tabaristan. And so I think part of the reason why it was able to survive for so long and in many cases thrive. It was because they were able to maintain friendly relations with the other vassal kingdom at a lot of different times, Bavand. And because they were also ruling under the Dabuids, that meant that they had kind of some higher support. And then through what I kind of researched as well, while Qarinvand and Bavand were working together to kind of oppose and resist Islamization efforts, the highlands were also kind of known as a very mountainous and difficult to navigate terrain. And so it partially kind of it helped them in staying out of trouble because it was so difficult to access the highlands. And so they were able to kind of keep ruling for as long as they did for one of many reasons, but that was a big one.
Makes sense. That's an interesting. Geography has been a common like supporting thread through a lot of these other empires of either how they've maintained their area, their trade, their whatever. If I'm not mistaken, Tabaristan is right on the sea, that part of northern Iran. Is that correct, Courtney?
Yeah. Tabaristan was a mountainous region along the Caspian Sea. And so it was one of the most populous and developed regions along the Caspian Sea. And so I think, like you kind of said, the geographic location, and then just the strategic ability of different leaders within Qarinvand to kind of like maintain their position within that region. It definitely helped them stay around for as long as they did. And one interesting and also difficult thing that I found in researching this, there's a really large lack of research in English on the topic. A lot of the research that's been done has been in Arabic, in Persian, in other languages, and so it can be really difficult to find information on Qarinvand. And then if you also factor in because the research is done in a lot of different languages, there are different ways to even spell Qarinvand. And so when you Google Qarinvand with one spelling, different articles might come up, and then you might have different articles come up with just changing one letter. So it can be very difficult to kind of group all of that research, and there could be even more research that I didn't access based on other spellings that I didn't think to check. So I think that was one of the hardest parts about researching Qarinvand, but there has been a lot of research done on the coinage. And I'm sure we'll kind of talk about that a little bit more later, but the Dubuyid section of Al-Fusayq also touched on this, obviously because they were linked.
Let's talk about it now. I was actually thinking the same thing about how were they able to sustain themselves, not just, like, because they clearly didn't have a lot of like expansionist sort of ideologies. They kind of like stayed in the Tabaristan highlands in this part, but how were they able to sustain? I mean, it was relatively rich, or this coinage thing. Talk about it more. I want to hear.
Sure. So the research that I found on numismatics, it has to do with coins. I think it's also paper currency and metals. And so by examining kind of the coins, especially that were found, they would oftentimes be like engraved with dates. And so that's how they confirmed how long certain leaders were even in power. Because if there was a lack of written record of like who the Abbasid governor was at that time, or who was in power, they could look at the coins that they find from that time, and they can at least kind of map a timeline of who may have been like the Abbasid governor at that time. And so I thought that was really interesting, especially because there has been so little research on Qarinvand. And of course, parts of it can be understood through its linked history with other dynasties, but the coins have definitely helped with that.
Coins are a lot more than just currency, or at least now looking back, it is like a historical marking. So I'm grateful that the coinage of Qarinvand and probably Dubuyid as well, the trading and whatnot, helped with your research. That's for some of the empires and dynasties we have, that has been the easiest way to actually learn about these communities. Yeah, fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. I think the coinages are really cool. If I'm not mistaken, the picture of the Dubuyid page is their coinage. So there you go. And you can see more about it, at least for sure, in the hyperlinks. I'm curious, sort of as you've mentioned a bunch, the Isbahbad, the vassal state, the ruling elements of this empire, probably one of the only well-known aspects given its connections to these other empires. So I'm curious if you can dive a little bit more into their ruling structure, how the vassal system worked, things that you learned from your research.
Sure. And so I will say also, as I've kind of mentioned, a lot of the research on Qarinvand is focused on numismatics. And then there's kind of spotty research in English based on the ruling system and the general history. And actually, a lot of the research is based on legend. And so it can be really difficult to say without a shadow of a doubt that this is what happened, this person took over for this person. And so a lot of the confirmed history is through the coins. But what we do know about the ruling system, was that, like I mentioned, they ruled parts of the highlands of Tabaristan. And then after the Abbasids annexed Tabaristan into the caliphate and kind of exercised control over the lowlands, local dynasties like Qarinvand and Bavand still continued to rule the highlands with autonomy for the most part. And so they kind of ruled in different with different strategies, Bavand and Qarinvand. And at least from my research, it seemed like the leader of Qarinvand was able to at least maintain somewhat friendly relations with, I believe, one of the Abbasid governors. And so, and I can check on that for sure. But if you go to the article and you look under allies and rivals, you can find some hyperlinks that talk about that as well.
That's usually how these sort of dynasties and empires are able to sustain their longevity through diplomacy. And this is where we learn that, these relations have, predated our time. And besides, trade and everything else, I think that there was this sort of idea of like expansionism during like the civilizations, and everyone had wanted to continue and then gain more land, but many of the dynasty or empire rulers realized that coming to a middle ground with another ruler was the best way to preserve their dynasty and empire and preserve the longevity. And we see that in Qarinvand because we see for how long they were able to maintain these relations and continue until the 11th century, which is amazing. I'm curious also to know that because we've talked about how difficult it was to find information on Caravan and everything spotty and different languages sort of idea. So how much of an influence do they have today? Is it only through Zoroastrianism as the religion, or is it Caravan left a mark in the world sort of thing?
I think a lot of people probably don't know very much about Qarinvand and about other dynasties of the time. And so I'd say in terms of modern influence, one of the largest points that I found was simply how the preservation of Zoroastrianism was probably one of the largest impacts on the modern world because of how long Qarinvand and Bavand were able to resist the spread of Islam in the highlands of Tabaristan. And so now we can still see Zoroastrianism persist in Iran, in India, and in parts of the world where it may have not persisted if Qarinvand had not kind of held out for so long. And so I think that that is probably a lot of the modern influence that we see. But of course, I'm sure that there are other influences, whether big or small, that we just may not know about yet. Or perhaps somebody has identified some of it in research that hasn't been published in English. So another little pitch on the importance of learning other languages.
Keep pitching. We love it. That's a very, very important thing. Yeah, I am excited that we have this series in English, and maybe a future version of this would be in other languages to share much more widely. But in the meantime, the information you do have is really helpful to sort of put this historical element together of this part of Iran. So again, thank you. That's the whole reason we do this series, is to demystify some of these elements of the history of the region. Um, I mean, it makes sense that, they were a mountain region and surrounded by water, so they had really both halves of their land was well protected, but it still is kind of a marvel that they lasted as long as they did. And so I'm curious if they had really good like allies or trading routes. Because they were a vassal, they weren't really paid attention to. I'm not sure. So I'm curious from your research, if it's one of those, a combo of those, or something different on how they lasted so long. This is longer than the majority of the empires we have here. So I'm curious if you noticed any specific details that aided their long reign.
Yeah, great question. So I think, and I also need to clarify too, that the dates of the actual rule of Qarinvand are also a little bit unconfirmed based on what I found. So it's because part of it is mixed in with legend. Some say that it ended at a certain time, and then there's also evidence that it continued well beyond that. And so it seems like it kind of depends on who the researcher is in terms of what they put the beginning and end dates as. But one theory as to what the downfall of the dynasty was, it's said to have occurred in multiple different phases. And so the leader at the time, Qarin ibn the Hormuzd, I probably did not say that correctly. But he agreed to aid the Abbasid Caliph during the Arab-Byzantine Wars, and the campaign was successful against the Byzantines, and he received a lot of honors for his help with this from the Abbasid Caliph. And this evoked a lot of jealousy, though, from the Bavand ruler of the time. And as a result, he annexed some of Qarinvand's territory, and then he later seized the rest of it during the rule of Qarin's son, Mazyar. And then eventually in the future, Mazyar was able to return to Tabaristan and kind of unite the highlands under his own leadership, because he had been expelled when his territories were seized. But he faced a lot of challenges, including from different Muslim settlers, because there had kind of been the clash between preserving Zoroastrianism and resisting against the spread of Islam. But he also faced other challenges, such as from the Tahirids. And they later seized Tabaristan with the help of Bavand, who sought to get their land back. And there were a lot of different betrayals and different challenges that happened, but that is one way that people think that the Qarinvand dynasty might have ended. Of course, there are other theories as well, but it's kind of difficult to confirm.
Yeah, and it usually is with these kind of things. We try to program them in order of, who was there before, who came next. And that's how I usually think about civilizations. I was like, okay, like what was the dynasty that came after the empire? But even by grouping them, I feel that, they could have ruled for that long, because I think from what I read on your article, it was that even if it wasn't like necessarily declared, they were still autonomous up to the 11th century, or to a certain extent unconfirmed, right? So I think, that most of the times these situations happen because of the preservation of the religion. And we see it today, as you mentioned, there's still Zoroastrianism in Persia, in modern day Iran. So it leads us to believe that the Qarinvand did, like, hold this fort and was there for as long as it was. It seems like their strongest ally was Bavand. They were kind of like a defenders of Qarinvand controlling the highlands, and if you have anything else to say about that, I was really into it when you were talking about the history and the allyship. It just, if there's any more information on that, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I think as we see, even in current politics around the world, sometimes countries or regions will work together when it's convenient and when it benefits both. But when it no longer is beneficial, sometimes they'll kind of clash. And I think that may have been the case with Qarinvand and Bavand. I think, they were allied because they were, occupying the same area of land in the highlands of Tabaristan, and they were both, under the Dabuyids. And so I think they had a lot of mutual goals, and also preserving Zoroastrianism. But then as I learned throughout my research, it seems like they may have also at certain points clashed, or maybe Bavand took it further than Qarinvand did. At one point, it seemed that Qarinvand was kind of trying to maintain friendly relations with an Abbasid governor, just in order to kind of like keep the peace. And this particular governor was also, he recognized the difficulty in trying to control the highlands. And so he kind of just let them do their own thing as long as the peace was still protected. But it seemed like in that way, Qarinvand was a little bit more interested in keeping the peace rather than, being in conflict.
A strategy that seemed to work for most of his history. Very interesting. Wow, yeah, this is so fascinating to sort of put together how Bavand and Dabuyid existed as a result of its engagements with Qarinvand. Because we've heard of the other two of this group of three, and so to hear it from the Qarinvand side is really interesting. The only thing I knew about Qarinvand at all before this series was Mazyar, one of the sons that you mentioned, being a super, infamous Zoroastrian ruler. So I'm curious if you have, more details about specifically him or even the element of Zoroastrianism with this empire, to exist this long, in Iran as Islam was growing through the Abbasid and other major caliphates. I'm just curious your ideas, engagements with Zoroastrianism and or Mazyar's rule. That is something I'm very interested by.
Yeah, it's definitely a very interesting part of the history. I will say, unfortunately, I don't have as much information on Maziar. I was also very interested to find out more in his role in all of this, but it seemed like each piece of research that I found opened more questions. And it also, it could be, like I mentioned before, difference in spelling names and spelling places. And so there could be a lot of research out there on his role specifically with Qarinvand. But at this time, I can't really expand as much on his contributions. But and I'm sorry, what was your other question?
The impact of Zoroastrianism. The only reason I knew Mazyar is because he's one of the most infamous Zoroastrian rulers throughout history when I did a course on Zoroastrianism. So that's all I knew about him. So fine if we don't know more. To our listeners, do some Googling. Mazyar was a very influential leader, but the religious dimension of this empire, subsisting and lasting as long as it did alongside Islam's growth, I think is really interesting. So if you have more details of the interfaith, Zoroastrian elements of this empire, I'd be curious to hear more.
Yeah, yeah. So I think kind of going back to the resistance of Islam in the area, there were different ways that that was kind of perpetuated at the time. Relations were really tense and at times really tumultuous between the Abbasids and the leaders of Qarinvan and Bavand. I mentioned that Qarinvan and Bavand would sometimes work together to resist Islamization in the area. And Bavand, I believe, actually banned the burial of Muslims in the highlands and also took some other measures to kind of push back against the spread of Islam. And I know that there were a lot of different, smaller things that kind of built up over time, as well as some larger violence that occurred. But it really depends on the different research sources. And I would hate to, say something that hasn't been fully confirmed or that is more part of the legend side of it. But it's very clear that relations were definitely tense at times in terms of preserving Zoroastrianism and making sure that the highlands remained autonomous.
I think it's just like when you said that researching more open more questions, I think that's kind of like sometimes like the goal of the writer to open questions on the reader and to dive in more. And who knows, maybe we'll have readers who speak the languages of some of the research that you didn't get to. So I think that that's what makes this whole series amazing, that we can learn more and we continue to learn in a connecting kind of way, as we've mentioned already, that the Dabui, the Bavan, Abbasids, and Karimvand was all kind of like grouped together in a way that makes sense throughout history, and that's the beauty of these civilizations. If you have any last thoughts or any something that strike to you that it's coming to your head and you want to make sure that it's said, please let us know. But otherwise, everything has been amazing.
Yeah, thank you so much again for having me. And I will say, researching this was really fun, really interesting, because I feel like how I really got into, the Swana region throughout my both academic history and throughout my work. It's it hinges upon history, but it's more of like the modern dynamics between countries and stuff. But it's so neat to be able to go back and look at the history that kind of brings the entire region together. And nothing made me see more than researching this. I have so much respect for the researchers that are out there, studying coins and linking these dynasties together that we wouldn't even really know about, all of these very specific details that could easily just get lost and that we would never know about if they weren't out there doing the hard work of, conducting this research. You can go to museums and you can read all about this, but being out there and actually doing the field research and conducting interviews and going through all these ancient texts, that takes a lot of work. And so I hope more people continue to do that. And yeah, thank you so much for having me again today. This was really neat to research, and I can't wait to kind of read more of the books that I identified throughout my research that deal with this.
Yay. We're excited to hear from you. There are other Alphazaic writers who have written longer articles after this 101 series because they had a question that they needed to answer or were excited to sort of see the connections of their empire and the predecessor or ally or trading partner or enemy or whatever. We have a couple maps of like the ancient desert cities across the region as an interactive map for as one example. I know there are several others. So if you want to do a deeper dive into Tabaristan, please, we are excited to read more about it. Thank you again, Courtney. We're thrilled to have had such a insightful webinar, first and foremost, learning about this overlooked part of Iranian and wider region history, especially for Zoroastrian communities. But also the series is done. We may add a few civilizations in the future, maybe we'll see. But at least for right now, we have hit all 93 of the empires, caliphates, dynasties, kingdoms we set out to. And just thank you again, Courtney, for finishing us off so strong. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And congratulations on finishing all of that.
You're a
That
part of
is
it.
a really big accomplishment. That is a lot of different dynasties to cover. And, even doing one, there's a lot to research about each thing. And so 93, that's a great accomplishment.
It's the end of an era for the civilizations in review. As Ben mentioned, maybe we'll have more in the future, who knows? But for now, this has been great and amazing. And I'd love to have ended with something that keeps us all thinking, question, but also answers a lot of what we don't know. So that was great. Thanks again, Courtney.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Incredible. Well, we will stop this call here. Thank you for your engagement, your learning. For all of you listening in, please go to the actual article itself. There's much more details there we didn't even get to cover. It's alphuzaic.net/civilizations101. And then you scroll down to Qarinvand. Qarinvand starts with a Q. Well, in this spelling, starts with a Q. There are several with K or otherwise. Anyways, thank you for listening and learning. And thank you again, Courtney, for writing, and Anna for your candor. And for our viewers for engaging with this content. Hope to see you at a future event, not this series as we have just finished now, but other ways to engage with the Swana region writ large. Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.